Good day. My name is Guy Sanders. I'm a 9/11 first responder and a volunteer at the 9/11 Tribute Museum in downtown Manhattan. Today I'm going to be telling you my 9/11 story. On Tuesday, September 11th of 2001, I was working part-time for a private ambulance company in Brooklyn. But because EMTs don't make a lot of money, I was working full-time in an office out in Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City. I was on my way to work that morning, a beautiful sunny morning, not a cloud in the sky. I was driving along the highway. I noticed the traffic was heavier going into Long Island than it normally is. Usually most people are driving into the city. But I was listening to music. I wasn't listening to the radio, so I didn't pay any attention to it. When I got to my office, I saw that there were clusters of my coworkers sitting around each other's desks listening to the radio. Of course, that was our primary source of information. Then this is before Facebook and before smartphones. When I asked what was going on, some of my coworkers said that a plane had crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. Like most people that day, I thought perhaps it was a small plane, a private plane, or someone was learning how to fly and got disoriented, or someone was flying a small plane and got sick. But after another 20 minutes or so went by, we heard about the second plane hitting the second tower, and I knew at that moment that it wasn't an accident. I knew we were under some type of attack. Again, I said I'm an emergency medical technician, so my first instinct was that they would probably need help down there. But I didn't want to just run down there. I wanted to be part of an organized effort. So I started calling my ambulance company. So I started calling the ambulance company, and every time I called, the line was busy. We had 5 or 6 different extensions. I called every single extension, and every time I called, the lines were busy. It was starting to get frustrating. In the interim, in my office, one of my coworkers was starting to cry because her boyfriend worked in one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and she was calling him and she couldn't reach him. So she was very distraught, and people were trying to comfort her, which heightened my sense of urgency. So I continued to try to call my ambulance company repeatedly over and over again, and I still couldn't get through. At some point, I talked to one of my coworkers, and I said to him, I said, this Washington, D.C. is next. And he says, no, I think they proved their point. And then we heard about the plane that hit the Pentagon. Now, my sense of urgency got even higher, and I kept calling my ambulance company. In the interim, in my office, some of the computers went down and some of the phones stopped working. But I still kept trying to call my ambulance company over and over again. At this point, I was so frustrated, I walked outside into the parking lot, and I noticed that the office building right next to our office was evacuating. They were the United States Department of Immigration and Naturalization. So I came back inside and I found my human resources director. I said, listen, they're evacuating the building next door. And he says, shh, don't say anything. We're still trying to figure out what we're going to do, which got me aggravated. And I ran back to my desk and I called my ambulance company again, and I got through. I said, do you need me? They said, we need everybody. I told them I was on my way. So I stood up in my office and I announced to everyone, they're evacuating the office building next door, and I'm on my way down there. You're on your own. And I left. Incidentally, they did end up letting everyone leave early, but they made them make up the time later. So at this point, I rush out to my car and I get on the highway. Now, this is New York, and most people are familiar with how traffic can be in New York. But as I got on the highway heading toward Manhattan, I realized that my car was the only car on the highway. Since we were under attack, the police had closed off all the major highways, thoroughfares, the bridges, and the tunnels leading into Manhattan, except for emergency vehicles and for first responders. So, like some type of bizarre dream or movie, I was on the highway by myself, and I drove as fast as I could through Nassau County, through the borough of Queens, to my residence in Brooklyn. I ran upstairs, changed into my uniform, grabbed my equipment, ran back to my car, and I drove as quickly as I could to my ambulance company, which was in central Brooklyn. By the time I had gotten there, the place was a beehive of activity. We had people rushing all over the place. We had our regular calls, but we had some of our ambulances who were sent down to the hospitals in the vicinity of the World Trade Center to remove people from the emergency room who had come there with minor injuries, to take them, or minor illnesses, to take them to farther away hospitals, so that the hospitals that were closer to ground zero would be able to better treat the people who were rescued. We didn't know at the time, but after the first couple of waves, there really weren't going to be that many more people. I spoke to my operations manager, and I told him, "Listen, I don't want to do that duty. I want to be down at ground zero." And he says, I understand. He says, "You have experience. I'm going to make sure you get down there." So he gave me an ambulance. He gave me a partner. He gave me 15 extra tanks of oxygen, and he told me to report to Beth Israel Hospital, which is in downtown Manhattan around 15th Street and 2nd Avenue. The reason why he didn't send me directly to the scene was this thing called the Tokyo Rule. In 1995-96 in Tokyo, Japan, there was a terror attack where a nerve agent, sarin gas, was released on the subway system. And as first responders came there, they were overcome by the gas. And then more responders came, and they also were overcome. And so all the rescuers needed to be rescued. To make sure there wasn't a repeat of this type of thing, they developed this rule where if you had a mass casualty incident, which is what the attacks on the World Trade Center towers was considered, and then something catastrophic happened, as what happened when the towers collapsed, they were going to wait until things settled before sending more units in. So I was going to be in that next wave of rescuers to go in after they told us it was going to be stable enough for us to go in. So I started heading to Beth Israel Hospital. But before I left my ambulance base, I noticed that there was a large whiteboard near the operations center, and there were 10 numbers on that board. Those 10 numbers were for 10 ambulances from my company that were missing and whose crews were unaccounted for. So in spite of this, I made my way through Brooklyn into Manhattan. I was on a main thoroughfare, Flatbush Avenue. They had changed it from a two-way traffic to have one side regular two-way traffic, and the other side was just emergency vehicles going into the city, into Manhattan from Brooklyn. So I'm driving through as quickly as I can. I get to the Brooklyn side of the Brooklyn Bridge, and a police officer stops me. He's got 5 firefighters in full gear with him. He says to me, "Listen, these guys are getting ready to walk across the bridge. Is it possible you can drive them across?" So of course, I said yes. So I jammed them in the back of my ambulance. Now, my ambulance isn't one of those large ambulances like you see the fire department has. It's one of the smaller van ambulances. But I was able to jam all of those people into that ambulance with the extra tanks of oxygen and take them across the Brooklyn Bridge. There were still people walking from Manhattan across the bridge. They were covered with this dust. I was driving into a cloud of dust. When I got on the other side, into the Manhattan side, only a few blocks from where the World Trade Center once stood, I looked around. I let the firefighters out, but everything was covered with this gray dust. It looked like a gray snow. There were still fires burning. There were cars that were crushed. And where I used to be able to see the World Trade Center towers, all I saw was smoke and hints of twisted metal and steel. I didn't stay there long. I wanted to get to my deployment as quickly as possible, so I reported up to Beth Israel Hospital. At this point, because I'm an EMS supervisor, I met with other supervisors, and we were briefed by a fire department EMS supervisor. They assigned ambulances to us. I received 5 ambulances, and they told us where we were going to deploy at. We deployed on Liberty and East End Avenue. While this was happening, some of my coworkers that had initially been reported missing were being brought back to Beth Israel Hospital. When we saw them, most of them were what we considered walking wounded, or they didn't have any visible injuries. They were able to walk on their own. And we saw them. We were just so happy to see them, and they were covered with this dust. And we ran up to them and we hugged them and we kissed them and we started joking with them. And some of them were literally pulling debris and rubble out of their pockets because they had been pulled out of the rubble themselves. And while this was occurring, we were told various stories about what they had experienced. Um, Down the line, I heard stories about how one of my coworkers was by his ambulance because what they did was one EMT would stay by the ambulance as a driver, and as people were being triaged, they would bring them out to the next available ambulance to be transported to the hospital. His partner was inside. He was outside by the ambulance when the tower started to collapse, and he had to run for his life. Um, the debris was starting to catch up to him, so he dove underneath a fire truck. But the force of the debris lifted up the truck that he was under. I later heard another story about we had a thing what we call the Merv, a mobile emergency response vehicle. It's like a large RV. It looks like a large recreational vehicle, but it actually has a lot of medical equipment and stretchers and oxygen and propane tanks and all sorts of things that are combustible in it. And it was parked near the towers as they started to collapse, and debris started to hit this vehicle and started to make it rock. One of our managers was inside, and he said he was going to jump out of the vehicle, out through one of the windows, but it started to flip over onto his side. He grabbed a mattress and he pulled over him to try to protect himself. He said he heard this large crash and an explosion, and then when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but blackness. He said at first, and it was silence. He said at first he thought he was dead, but then he realized, if I think I'm dead, I'm not dead. But he couldn't see anything. He couldn't navigate anywhere. But he said through this black smoke came this hand that grabbed him by the arm and lifted him up. And it was a firefighter. And he looked at him and said, "Run." And they both started to run. And as they were running, he said this debris field was following them. And they got to a place that looked like a dead end. And he said he thought he was going to have to jump over the railing into the river. But he said at the very last second, the firefighter grabbed him and tossed him through these revolving doors. And as he spun into these doors, he saw this huge debris field go past. But he said the firefighter never made it in with him. We also got word that one of my coworkers did not survive. She had passed away. I'll talk a little bit more about her a little later on. So in the midst of all of this, we get the word that it's time for my group to start heading down to where we were deploying. So we drive down, lights and sirens blaring, and we finally get to where we're deploying. I got briefed by the vice president of my ambulance company, who had been there when the towers fell. I checked in with a fire department EMS captain, myself, and another supervisor for my ambulance company. And as we started to deploy our people and set up things, getting our equipment out of the ambulances and so forth and checking in, I noticed that in the middle of the rubble on a little plastic chair, there was a U.S. Army soldier. She was a staff sergeant. She was wearing her Class B uniform, so she had on her beret, she had her ribbons on. She was also wearing a surgical mask and latex gloves, and she was sitting in that little plastic chair with her legs crossed and her hands folded in her laps like this. And I walked over to her and I said, "Are you all right?" She says, "I'm a U.S. Army recruiter. I was on my way into my office in the World Trade Center when I saw a plane hit the building." She said that she was also an emergency medical technician. So when they set up the triage area, she went in there to help with triage. And she said that's where she was when the tower started to collapse, and she ran for her life. And then she got really, really quiet. And she says, "I'm thinking about the people that I left behind when I ran out of the building." And I realized she was feeling guilty because she had saved her own life. And I didn't want to leave her alone by herself that way. So I said to her, "Listen, you obviously have a lot more experience than the people I'm working with here. Why don't you come with us and help us out? We could benefit from your knowledge and expertise." And she came with us, and we kept her with us. I think she stayed with us until about midnight that night when we were relieved. Interestingly, she said that she had been in Bosnia, and I asked her. I said, "You look like you know." She had a lot of ribbons. I said, "You like you've seen a lot of action in different places." And she said, "Yeah." I said, "I guess you never thought you'd see anything like that here." And she says, "No." And she was very quiet. Like I said, I brought her with us. Most of the time when we were there wasn't a lot for us to do. At one point, not long after we got there, we got a call that there was an elderly person trapped in her apartment. There's a housing complex across the street from the World Trade Center complex, and large complex. And apparently there was an elderly woman because all the power was off in her building that was trapped in the 33rd floor of her apartment building. So we had to go into that building, climb up the 33 flights of stairs, and carry her down to get her out of the building. At one point, there was a firefighter who came up to me because he had a lot of this dust and debris in his eyes, and he wanted us to wash out his eyes with sterile water. So I said, "Okay, sure, have a seat, sit right here." And he says, "No, I'm not going to sit down." He said, "If I sit down, you're going to try to make me lay down. Make me lay down. You're going to try to take me out of here, and I'm not going anywhere. So I'm going to stand here, and you do what you need to do." So I let him stand there, and we did what we needed to do. Around 5:25 in the afternoon, um, Building 7 of the World Trade Center started to come down. And we were about block and a half away when that took place. There were a group of firefighters, maybe 20 firefighters, walking in the direction of our staging area in a very deliberate manner. There was no angst about it. And one of them happened to turn to me and said, "Hey, you should probably move this. This building's getting ready to go." And they all just kept walking. I was like, "Whoa, it's building's getting ready to go. All right, everybody, we have to get our equipment together, take all our stretchers and all our equipment, leave the ambulances in place because they were charged fire lines, and you don't want to drive over a charged fire line because you could cut off water to firefighters who were fighting fires." So I said, "Okay, get our equipment. We're going to go half a block over to the east." And one of my people actually said to me, "Well, they told us we should be safe here." And I pointed to the crushed fire trucks and the overturned ambulances and the smoldering police cars. And I said, "They told them they were going to be safe there too. Why are you even questioning me?" So most of that evening, what we did was we actually just dealt with other first responders. Um, the injuries that they received, going in and looking for people to save, looking for their brother firefighters, fellow police officers. And that's a lot of what we did in that first night. Um, I have to say that my phone service, my cell phone service was intermittent at that time. One of the reasons for that is because the two World Trade Center towers being the tallest buildings in the city, they had, in addition to the large radio tower on the North Tower, a series of repeaters and other towers for cell phones on top of them. So when they collapsed, it disrupted cell phone service in addition to the high volume of calls that were going out during that time. So my phone was working intermittently. So that's why when my phone finally rang, after not having had a dial tone for a while, I was surprised and I picked it up, and it was my best friend. And I said to him, his name is Jason. I said, he said, "Oh, I just want to make sure you were there." And I'm like, "Why?" Because he knew I had the two jobs. He said, "Because I'm thinking about all the people who went to work today to a job that they hated and died at a job that they hated." He said, "I know that if you went there and something happened to you, you were doing what you wanted to do." And that was something that was very profound to me. And it really, really made me think. And it kind of changed the direction of my life. Because at that point, I decided I needed to start working EMS full time. Because I never, ever wanted to be in a situation again where help was needed and I couldn't immediately respond. Because I made that decision in 2005, I was able to respond with 65 people from my ambulance company and 15 ambulances from New York to Louisiana for Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and I'm proud of my service there. Um, it was something that I said it was an event that touches me still today. Um, it's a picture here of myself down there. The gentleman here, my partner, his name was Wesley Watson. He also was a part-time supervisor with my ambulance company. His full-time job, however, was as a professional jazz drummer. He was an excellent jazz drummer. I've seen him perform on many occasions. He played the White House with the Lionel Hampton Orchestra 3 times. He performed all over the world. He performed with Wilson Pickett and Ashford and Simpson and Whitney Houston and all kinds of other talented luminaries. Wesley passed away in September of 2010. I believe that his illnesses were related to the time that he spent down at Ground Zero. He was down there actually more often than I was. He had been deployed down there, and I definitely miss him. In a month after that, I was diagnosed with a rare cancer, a carcinoid cancer, which is a neuroendocrine tumor that I got that is credited to my service down at Ground Zero. Since then, I've had 3 major surgeries. They removed 2.5 feet of my small intestine, part of my liver, my gallbladder. I had 2 of my heart valves replaced. And now, about 2 weeks ago, I was told that those 2 valves that were replaced are now defective, and I'm going to have to undergo open heart surgery again. However, if one was to ask me if I was to do that again, not only would I do it again, but if I had to do it over, I would have left earlier. Now, people think that that's a sacrifice, but there were 8 emergency medical technicians who paid the ultimate sacrifice on that day. Okay. Of these 8 emergency medical services personnel, I personally knew or met with 3 of them. The gentleman here in the black and white picture, his name is Mario Santoro. When Mario was a brand new emergency medical technician, he came to my volunteer ambulance corps in Queens to learn the trade, and I was in charge of training him. Mario had actually made it home after working a double shift, and he lived in downtown Manhattan. And when he heard about what happened and he could see the towers burning from his home, he told his wife he had to go back, even though he had just gotten home. Mario and his partner here, okay, Keith Fairburn, who was assigned as his partner when he went back, both lost their lives down at the World Trade Center that day. Mario left behind a 2-year-old daughter and a 5-month-old son. This gentleman here, his name is David Mark Sullins. Mark, also, I knew, he worked at Cabrini Medical Center. He had also worked a double, going back, though, in order to help out, and he lost his life helping out on that day. This young lady here was my coworker. Her name is Yamel Marino. She was deployed from the Bronx. Her partner was outside, standing by the ambulance, and she was inside with the president and vice president of my ambulance company when the tower started to collapse. They all ran for their lives and they exited the building together. But once they got outside, they separated. And whereas the president and vice president of my company survived that day, Yamel did not. Yamel, who was a 24-year-old single mom with an 8-year-old son, she was the first of all the first responder funerals. And I'll always remember her funeral because it was raining lightly that day. And her son had on a bright yellow slicker. And right before we lowered her coffin, there was a blast from the siren, and we all saluted. And you could hear people audibly crying. And her son went over to her coffin and hugged her coffin. And I'll always, always remember that. It's seared into my memory. So now that 20 years have passed, what can I say? We're getting ready to go into this 20th anniversary. Life has changed inalterably for many people. There are 1,100 people who died that day that left no trace. They could not be found. A lot of their families don't have closure. So it's 20 years later and they still have not found trace of them. Of the over 2,000 people who died on that day, there have been at least almost the same amount of people that have died from cancers and respiratory ailments and other serious ailments related to September 11th. It's 20 years later. And as I told you about my own medical problems, yes, 20 years later, people are still dying from the events of September 11th. One of the things that stick with me about that day, and that here 20 years later, I still remember, is the idea that your life can change in seconds. How many people that day maybe got into an argument with somebody they loved and cared about, and walked out the door, slammed the door and said, you know what, I'll make it up to them later on. But later on never came. And the last thing they said to someone that they loved and cared about was not something loving and caring. So when I think about that, I say this as a cautionary tale. Whenever you're with someone that you love and you care about and you part with them, make sure that we don't ever leave them without telling them, I love you. Make sure that the last words you say to them whenever you depart from them are always happy, good words. Because you never know if the last thing you say to someone is going to be the very last thing you say. What do you want that to be? It's important as we come into this 20th anniversary. I remember all the signs that said, united we stand. I remember all the signs that said, never forget. Because we look around us in the environment that we have today where there's so much division and anger and angst, it seems that that idea of unity is gone. When I look around at how many people have forgotten how EMTs and paramedics and firefighters and police officers and construction tradesmen and transit operators and all kinds of volunteers from all over the place, over 500,000 people from all over the world came and volunteered their time to help out in some way, whether it was sifting through the rubble for remains, whether it was serving coffee, whether it was cutting heavy steel, whether it was transporting workers back and forth, whether it was opening the churches for them to sleep, whether it was preparing meals, all of those people, okay, many of them gotten sick, but all of them have been affected by that. But so many of us have forgotten the lessons of that day. And I think it's important for us 20 years later to reflect. I think it's important for us 20 years later to revisit why we said those things. Were they an excuse for prejudice and bigotry, or whether the realization of the humanity of everyone. When you listen to the reading of the names every year, there are all types of names from all types of ethnic backgrounds, all types of religious backgrounds, all types of trades, all types of professions. All of them lost their lives on that day. All of them are united in that. And you come down to the World Trade Center Memorial and you look at the waterfalls. That's one of the symbols of that waterfall. That these droplets of water come down as individuals, and they pool at the bottom, and then they go into this abyss for which you can't see the end. And what that symbolizes that these are individuals who came together in tragedy and went off into eternity together. They all met the same fate. And it's important for us to remember that we all will meet the same fate. And that's a lesson that we should never forget. That's a lesson that should make us united. And I think that's one of the most important lessons that we can continue to take from the events of that day. Not of the hatred, of the bigotry, but of our humanity. And we should keep our humanity. So I thank you for giving me this time to speak to you. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I appreciate it.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Guy, for sharing your personal story, as well as the stories of your friends and colleagues, and as well as the very, very powerful message at the end there. You know, remembering people's humanity is something that these days we've seemed to have forgotten. And, you know, in this year of the 20th anniversary, it's really important for us to remember that and revisit that and practice that, because, you know, we are truly stronger together. And this divisiveness that we're, you know, living within is not productive. It's not helpful. It doesn't get us anywhere. And, you know, it shouldn't take a tragedy for us to remember how, you know, how human people are. So very, very powerful message. And I thank you immensely for, you know, sharing that within your story.
Thank you for the privilege.
And as Guy mentioned, if you do have any questions for him, please feel free to add them to the comment section, and I will be sure to get those questions over to him to get them answered for you. We also do live programs, and we'll hopefully have Guy on those programs as well, so you can talk to him in real time as well. So follow us on Facebook at 911 Tribute Museum to get those schedules for our live programming. So once again, Guy, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you for the privilege.
Absolutely. And we thank you for watching. And we will catch you on the next program. Thank you for watching.